Hello, everybody, and today we begin our lectures for the second semester of AP World History. And what we're going to focus on is imperialism. You see here, I have my Star Wars cup, and that, of course, is the Galactic Empire. So, if you know anything about the Empire from Star Wars, you already understand a lot about imperialism. So, what we're going to focus on is the idea of rationales, the motivations and the justifications for imperialism. So before we get started, what we want to do is we want to do a quick overview of imperialism. Some fancy things for you guys to keep in mind that you can always use as the basic generalizations for this particular topic. So when we talk about a definition of new imperialism, I'm sorry, with this much talking, I've got to stay hydrated. First, we tend to look at the period from 1870 to 1914. And this is a nice general time frame for when imperialism is at its height. The reality is that some of this imperialism was already going on well before the 1870s, but this is when the expansion of European powers into different parts of the world really starts to take off. And it's not just Europe, but it's also Japan and the United States. So that brings me to the second point. When we talk about new imperialism, we're largely focused on the 19th century going up to the eve of World War One. That's generally speaking the new imperialism. And the new imperialism is dominated by industrialized nations. And the big five are going to be Britain, France, the United States, Germany, and Japan. Those are your big five. However, we also will see Belgium, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Russia, and the Netherlands involved in this imperialism as well. Some of it is going to be a holdover from the 17th century in the 18th century when Europe was expanding throughout the globe. So the idea that the Spanish would be in Cuba and Puerto Rico at the beginning of the 19th century, or that the Dutch would be in the East Indies, that would be a continuation of things we've already seen. But the big players, the ones who really expand and have a much bigger influence throughout the globe during this time, are the big five: Britain, France, the United States, Germany, and Japan. And largely, this new imperialism focuses on Asia, Africa, Latin America, and we'll talk about how that's different there, and Oceania. Now, Asia, when we talk about Asia, it can be East Asia, such as China, it can be Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam. And when we talk about South Asia, we can also put in South Asia, which we'll start referring to more and more as India. With Africa, it's the whole continent with a couple exceptions. But otherwise, it's going to be the whole continent that's going to be divvied up and split up amongst the European powers. Latin America, we'll talk more about in detail. That's a lot more economic influence. And when we talk about Oceania, we're really talking about Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii. Those are going to be the big three that we'll focus on. But you can also put in a lot of the South Pacific islands, such as Fiji, Guam, America, Samoa, the Canary Islands, the Solomon Islands, all of those islands that pop up throughout the South Pacific. We're going to fold into this, but the big ones that we're going to focus on are New Zealand and Hawaii, actually, even more so than Australia. And there's really two types of imperialistic control. So when we talk about imperialism, you can have the political form of imperialism, which is where one nation controls another. Okay, so a great example of a political form of imperialism would be the British control in South Asia. The British Empire is going to colonize and set up control over South Asia, in a sense, making India part of the British Empire. Not just in a sense, in a very real way. So there's your political control where the government of whatever country is governing and administering the affairs of another nation. And that's usually what we think of when we talk about imperialism. We can also see economic control, where a country does not directly control the political affairs of another country, but the more powerful country can exert a great deal of economic influence and will intervene in the affairs of another country. And a great example of this would be in China. China never becomes a colony of any European nation. However, Western economic interests exert a great deal of control over Chinese policy. And that would be a form of economic imperialism. So you do want to appreciate that there's really two types of imperialism. And sometimes the government's not even involved. It could just be, for example, an American business setting up in a foreign land, and that American business exerting influence over the political affairs of that country. It's separate from the government, but it's supported by the government. So you have to understand imperialism can take many different forms. When we talk about causes of imperialism, we're going to focus a lot on rationales for imperialism. When we talk about causes, there's really two. One, this is a natural effect of industrialization. When Europe undergoes industrialization, and so does the United States, and eventually so does Japan, imperialism becomes the next step because industrialization requires resources to fuel the production. If my economy is based on production, I need resources. And either I deplete the resources I have, or I need access to more resources that I just don't have. And that's going to start pushing for expansion. But and the second thing, sorry, the second thing about industrialization is the need for markets. If I'm producing all these goods, I need to sell it to somebody. And so increasing my access throughout the global community and opening up markets to take in my cheap goods is something that's going to become an incentive for me. So, between needing new markets and needing resources, industrialization has to precede this new imperialism. And we're going to see that with the US, we're going to see that with Europe, we're going to see that with Japan. When those three economies industrialize, shortly thereafter, they begin to engage in imperialism. We also have the fact that industrialization provides technological advantages that allows imperialism to happen. So one of the greatest technological advantages that Europe, the United States, and Japan will develop is the ability to mass produce superior military technology. Simply put, these three regions are going to become militarily more powerful. They're going to have better weapons at their disposal, and that's going to give them the ability to conquer and bring under control many different regions throughout the world. The other thing is medical advances, and we're going to talk more about this when we talk about Africa. But the idea is that Europeans, Americans, Japanese going into new areas and new regions, having that medical technology gives them an edge because they're able to protect themselves from becoming infected by diseases that they haven't been exposed before. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the European imperialism of Africa. And then the last one is steamboats, the development of technology that deals with transportation. And we can put in locomotives as well, but we really focus on steamboats because that allows the Europeans, the Americans, and the Japanese to expand their reach throughout the globe much faster. And then lastly, the impact of imperialism. Imperialism is going to be another game changer to world history because what it does is it transmits, for better or for worse, Western practices, Western ideas, and Western technologies throughout the globe. So we're going to start seeing a lot of changes to the non-European, non-American regions of the globe because of the introduction of scientific principles that had been developed in Europe and now is expanding and finding a global audience. The idea of industrialization expanding across the globe is because of imperialism. The idea of new styles of fashion, new technologies, new forms of entertainment are all going to be connected to this developing imperialism and this developing expansion of Western ideas and Western culture. And then the second thing is the increased role of the industrial world. in a way, what's happening is that if in the 19th century, the countries who are industrialized are going to end up at a better position than the countries who are not. And the countries that are industrialized are going to be able to increase their wealth, often at the expense of the countries who are not industrialized. And what happens is a split develops between the developed world, the developing world, and the underdeveloped world. And we're going to have this split amongst the globe that continues today. So a lot of what we see today, I just saw that I froze. A lot of what we see today is a consequence of this imperialistic period of time. Now, if you take a look at the cartoon and you see England having a reach all across the globe to different pieces, this is a wonderful example of what imperialism kind of entails. This idea of a European presence and also an American presence throughout the globe. And we're going to put Japan in, even though they come late and their presence is going to be largely limited to Asia. There's still a significant player that we want to talk about. So, as we go through this unit of imperialism, we're going to be looking at each region to take a look at how imperialism affects that region. We're going to want to keep in mind how all of these things keep coming back and are being reinforced by the case studies we're going to engage in. All right, so let's start talking about rationales. So, one rationale is the social Darwinist rationale, which I would lump under a category called ideological. So, the first thing is what justifies Europe, the United States, and Japan eventually in engaging in imperialism. And we start first with social Darwinism. So, you've got to start before you talk about social Darwinism, is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin comes up with basically the theory of evolution. This idea that species who have mutations or adaptations or genetic traits that allow them to survive in a changing environment crowds out species who cannot survive in a changing environment. One species survives and thrives, the other species dies off. Charles Darwin is going to call this natural selection. And to him, this is simply a natural process that explains how some species continue through time and other species dies off. However, what some people do is they take that idea of Charles Darwin and they apply it to human society. Charles Darwin was not a social Darwinist. What happens is that these thinkers take the Darwin theory of evolution and they apply it to group dynamics. And what they start to say is that people belong to different groups. Now, you can probably see where all of this is going. And some groups have the advantage and have the traits that allow them to thrive and survive, while other groups do not have those traits, and that's going to regulate them to a inferior status. So, what the social Darwinists start to do is they start to advance this idea that human beings are engaged in an evolution. And this is where I'm going to coin a term called evolutionary humanism. And the basic idea of evolutionary humanism is that human beings are in a position, and this is 19th century thinking, are in a position where they're evolving. And some groups are going to go forward while other groups are going to go back. And therefore, there are some groups who are going to be superior to other groups. And this becomes a justification for imperialistic expansion. Basically, the group that's doing the expansion, the Europeans, they look at their technological advantages, they look at their military strength, and they conclude that it must be because they have something innate within them. There's something special within the European people. And this extends to Americans as well. And then the Japanese will also talk about this. And what's happening is that this group can better utilize the resources of the world, therefore, they're more entitled to it. So, a social Darwinist would look at underdeveloped regions in, say, Africa. So, they would go to Africa and they would look around and they would say, well, the people who live here have done nothing with this land of productive value. we can do more with this land, therefore we should have it. And the social Darwinist idea justifies that decision, and it becomes a rationale. So if you say, what justified imperialism? If you asked a 19th century European, they would probably say, well, because we're the superior humans. There's something innate in us that makes us superior to the others. That's what they would say. And that's when you get to social Darwinism and racism. So you want to kind of tie these two together. When we talk about modern racial attitudes, we talk about modern ideas of racism. In a lot of ways, modern ideas of racism are rooted within this 19th century approach. Because what happens is you take this idea that there's a survival for of the fittest, that in a way the human species is engaged in a competition within itself. And some groups of humans are competing against other groups of humans. Some groups of humans are more um, they're more apt, they're more suited to win this competition. And that connects also to another development of the time, Mendel's works on genetics. Now, maybe you remember from biology the idea of hereditary traits, the idea that traits pass along. And you guys may have done a pundit square where there's dominant traits and recessive traits, so on and so forth. Mendel, who's a Austrian monk, figures this out and he begins this work on genetics and this idea that traits pass from one generation to another. So the social Darwinists are going to take that idea that the whole world is one big competition. And they're also going to combine that with the idea that groups pass along traits to one another. And if the trait is associated with superiority or the trait is associated with inferiority, then what happens is that in the minds of these social Darwinists of the 19th century, those traits pass on through the generations. In other words, we create a hierarchy of races where the scientific community of the 19th and 20th century is justifying this hierarchy that puts Europeans at the top and then subsequent groups towards the bottom. That this hierarchy is natural. It is the result of one group having superior genes and another group having inferior genes. And when we come back to evolutionary socialism, I'm sorry, evolutionary humanism, the idea is the group with the superior genes are threatened by the group with the inferior genes. And that, I mean, that, ladies and gentlemen, is laying the basis for Nazism. It's laying the basis for genocide that's going to come later. It's going to start laying a lot of groundwork that is going to explain a lot of things that we see happen since then. Now, I want to put out a disclaimer. This is the way 19th century thinkers and 20th century thinkers are thinking about it. Obviously, this line of thinking has been greatly diminished and has been greatly refuted. Yet, we would be foolish to believe that this line of thinking has completely disappeared. So, this is why I'm spending some time about it, because it becomes the basis for a lot of the issues we're dealing with now. So, that social editoring aside, let's talk about white man's burden, which is another rationale based out of ideology. So, when we talk about ideology, we have to understand that we're talking about a belief that the European Western civilization is a superior civilization. Social Darwinism would say the European people or the Western people are a superior people. But white man's burden kind of gets to the idea that the European society represents the height of civilization. And if you take a look at this cartoon, you'll see that on one side, you have Lady Liberty with civilization as her flag, followed by Europeans who are, willing to fight to bring civilization, but also to bring industry and to bring farming. They represent different aspects of civilization. And then across the other side are non Europeans. Not sure exactly what group they're supposed to represent, but the flag there says barbarianism. So this idea of white man's burden is that imperialism represents a fight between the forces of civility, the forces of civilization, versus the forces of barbarianism. And civilization is defined as European culture, and barbarianism is defined as non European culture. So this brings us to this expression, white man's burden. And the basis for the white man's burden expression comes from a poem written by a man named Kipling. Now, you may recognize Kipling's name as associated with the Jungle Book, which is what the Disney movie is based on. But the poem, White Man's Burden, basically the first few lines went, take up take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' needs. So this poem was saying, and this is the mentality, was that Europeans had an obligation to go to the areas where civilization didn't exist and to bring civilization to those people, that this was the burden Europeans carried. And that is going to manifest itself in many different ways. It's going to manifest itself into the establishment of schools throughout non European areas, staffed by Europeans, teaching European language, teaching math, science, European history, philosophy, a lot of the Western curriculum being taught to non Europeans. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay. Um, Second, you have missionary work, and this really gets identified with white man's burden. Missionaries going out trying to bring Christianity to non-Europeans, but also trying to put in European values because of the view that European values are civilized and therefore superior. And then we also have the Enlightenment ideals. Remember that the Enlightenment ideas placed an emphasis on reason over superstition, placed an idea that human beings were progressing to something greater. And to try and bring the ideas of the West to the world, the people doing this believed that they were bettering the world, that they were bringing light to the dark corners of the earth. And white man's burden is built on the assumption that the European Western civilization, when I say European, I should throw in American as well, because American missionaries did the same things. A European slash American civilization was the ultimate development of human beings. In other words, these values and these ways of living was the most civilized people could be, and that they had an obligation to spread it to everyone else. And this is going to form a type of paternalism. And paternalism is going to pull from the idea of the father caring for the children, the idea of the parent making decisions for the children because the children are deemed unable to decide for themselves. So, a lot of when we look at imperialism and interaction between Europe and the United States with the rest of the world, we're going to see this attitude that these civilizations know better and that the other civilizations, whether they be African, Asian, they're not advanced enough in the eyes of the Europeans and the Americans at this time to make the decisions for themselves. And again, if we come up to the 21st century, I would argue that that attitude is still prevalent, where Western societies look at non Western societies as being backwards, primitive, stuck in the past, many different adjectives that we can use like that. And that there are many people who say, well, we have an obligation to solve their problems. And some would argue that's just a continuation of the white man's burden. So those two, social Darwinism and white man's burden, forms the basis for an ideological rationale for imperialism. But those aren't the only rationales. Another is the economic rationale, which most people think is the most important rationale. And one is access to raw materials. So that means that mining operations are going to grow and develop, particularly throughout Africa, as European countries and European businesses seek to access the mineral deposits that are found throughout Africa, whether it be gold or it be diamonds or it be oil. There's going to be mining operations, and I understand that oil is not mined necessarily, but there are going to be operations to access these raw materials, and a lot is going to be taken out of Africa and then kind of absorbed into the European Western society. Cash cropping is something we're going to see a great deal of throughout these non European countries, where communities are going to grow and develop crops, whether it be tea or it be coffee or it be, in the case of, we remember sugar. This cash cropping is going to become the basis of a colony's economy. And it's going to provide these materials cheaply to European customers. The second is new markets for European goods. Europe's industrialization means that they want to sell products to non Europeans. And we see this particularly in South Asia, which we can also call India at this point. Um, Britain is going to start selling their textiles into the Indian economy. And the British, by controlling India, are going to set the rules up to favor the British textile manufacturers. So European goods are going to be flooding in, British goods in this case. British goods are going to be flooding into South Asia, undermining local economies, undermining local industries, and bringing in these cheap products to be sold. China is another example that gets flooded with Western goods. And it's not just Britain in this case, but it's also France, the United States, Russia. Eventually, Japan is going to carve out their interests. And these access for markets drives a lot of decisions because it opens up places for European and American businesses and Japanese businesses to sell the goods that they're producing. Third one is the use for cheap labor. Simply put, there's cheaper labor available outside of Europe and the United States and within those two regions. And having that cheap labor to do the mining operations, having that cheap labor to do the cash cropping is only going to increase profits for a business. So, take, for example, Hawaii. As businesses, American businesses set up there, they begin plantations, such as sugar plantations, but they also produce pineapples, for example. And the people harvesting those pineapples, cultivating those pineapples are cheap labor. And that's going to increase the profitability of the business. So again, with the examples, we'll come to them more and more. And all of this is connected back to industrialization. So the needs created by industrialization are new markets and the need for access to resources. And then the other one is the lowering of costs. What industrialization does is it makes it cheaper to expand. So taking over a country is an expensive proposition. But if I can mass produce the weapons involved because of the industrial products process, I can lower the cost of imperialism and thus encourage that policy. So when we look at the economic rationale, industrialization is at the root of that. Industrialization creates the need for resources and markets, but industrialization also creates the means by which industrialization becomes, I'm sorry, by industrialization creates the means by which imperialism becomes affordable for a nation. Now, if you take a look at the cartoon, you'll see, the grab bags. And you have the German grab bag, you have the Russian grab bag, the British grab bag. This would show you an economic motivation that these European countries are grabbing resources and grabbing from different parts of the world, dividing the world up so that they can fill their bags with wealth. Our next rationale is going to be religious. So now, again, we come back to the missionaries. And we've always known that missionaries are part of history, they're part of that element of cultural diffusion. And as we have an increase in global connections, as we have an increase in economic trade routes, we are always going to get missionaries going along those trade routes, spreading religions. We saw it with Buddhists in the Silk Road. We saw it with Islam through the Indian Ocean. We see it with Catholicism with the Spanish and Portuguese spread. New imperialism, we have a similar feature. And in this case, it's going to be Protestant. Since England is the primary mover of new imperialism, and England is a Protestant nation, it would make sense that the Protestant faith is going to see an expansion during this time. Um, you're going to see a lot of the Protestant faith spreading throughout the parts of the world that Europe comes into touch with. And the biggest penetration is going to be in Africa, Oceania, and parts of Asia. Really, Africa and Oceania is where we're going to see the largest uptick in Christian conversion and missionary work. The impact of the missionaries, some would argue that they were positive, some would argue they were negative. One of the impacts is that a lot of these missionaries, especially the ones who go into Africa, go in as opponents of illegal slave trade. So, if you remember from last semester, abolition is bringing an end to the slave trade globally. But that doesn't mean it goes away. It just means it's been outlawed. But the trading of enslaved peoples continues on. And a lot of missionaries who came into Africa were motivated by a desire to make sure that illegal slave trade also is brought to an end. On the other hand, a lot of these missionaries taught, particularly throughout Africa, that their traditional practices were backwards and primitive and had to go. We see that in the Philippines, we see that throughout in Hawaii, we see that throughout Africa, where the European and American missionaries are saying, your practices are primitive, they're savage. This is how you do things as a civilized person. And this is how you dress. This is how you speak. This is how you interact with other people. And that is a great example of white man's burden. That's a great example of the justification of social Darwinism. So a lot of traditional practices throughout Africa, throughout Hawaii, throughout the Philippines is going to be curtailed, if not outright ended. The other thing is that missionaries do bring in medical knowledge and also educational ideas. There's a lot of people who are going to be exposed to the ideas of the Enlightenment, particularly about natural rights, about democratic governments, and they're going to use those Enlightenment values to form the basis for justifying breaking away. So it's interesting, these Western ideas are going to come to different parts of the globe, and they're going to influence nationalist groups who seek to reject the Western presence. That's coming down the road. And then lastly, paving the way for future control. What some people argue is that the missionaries were like the shock troops, if you will, of imperialism. They were paving the way for future imperialistic expansion by kind of transforming these populations into Europeans, the argument goes. They were making it easier for European businesses to come in and start establishing themselves. So if you look at the picture on the right, this is a very typical picture. Now, in this case, this may be Jesuits, but this kind of paternalistic attitude towards non-Europeans that the missionary showed is coupled with the attitude of white man's burden. To these two missionaries, I am sure that they believe they were doing the good work of the Christian faith and trying to spread civilization to people who needed it. And that is the concept of white man's burden at work. Okay. Our last rationale is the political rationale. And this gets tied into nationalism. Nationalist policies means that you always put your nation's interest first. In other words, you take the ideal, the needs of the nation, and you say that whatever policy you make must always benefit your nation above all. So if you think about this, I see where this is going. If you think about this, the it's more than just love of one's nation. Nationalism is the idea that I'm going to fight to preserve my nation. And I have to do everything possible to win that fight so that I can survive. And therefore, all these decisions of imperialism are going to be motivated by nations, particularly European nations, but Japan and the United States as well. It's going to be motivated by a desire to keep their nation strong. There's also public pressure. All these nations have a lot of people voting for the government, and voters like to see winners. Voters like to see that their nation is winning. And so there are going to be imperialistic policies made as a response to the public pressure to stay competitive with the globe. And then we get to the nature of European diplomacy. And if you take AP European history, we go into so much more detail. It's so awesome. So sign up for the course. But the nature of European diplomacy in the 19th century, they're on the verge of war with one another all the time. They're competing for access to markets. They're competing for access to lands and resources. If you look at the cartoon on the right, you'll see that here the European countries and Japan are all kind of competing with each other for a slice of the pie that is China. And China's in the background, helpless to stop this. But since European diplomacy hinged on imperialism, Europe is going to be more involved, more motivated to expand because they want to keep up with one another. They don't want to let anybody get the advantage. And that brings us back to the influence of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism says we're in one big competition. And I presented social Darwinism initially as Europeans seeing themselves as superior to non Europeans. And that this idea of superiority justified, in their minds, them taking land from other people. However, this social Darwinism also goes into the Europeans because the Europeans don't see themselves as one race necessarily. The British saw themselves as a race. The French saw themselves as a race. The Germans saw themselves as a race. The Americans saw themselves as a race. And there is a competition amongst these groups. And if you weren't out in the front grabbing land, getting land, and building up your empire, you were going to be left in the dust. So, this competitive element that social Darwinism brings in is going to also play into imperialism. Now, that's the basic 5 rationales of imperialism, or actually 4: the ideological, the economic, the religious, and the political. And these all justify the decisions of Europeans and America and Japan to go out and build up empires. Now, if this is all you needed, the rationales for imperialism, you can stop the video now. However, we do want to go on to one more thing, which is really writing skills for the SAQ. This is going to relate to the assignment connected to this lecture. When we write an SAQ, remember on the AP exam, you'll get 3 SAQs. Each SAQ has 3 parts. You can answer, if you answer 2 of the 3 parts, then they'll grade those 2 and they won't grade the 3rd. So we'll talk more about that. But each part is worth 1 point. Each SAQ is worth 3 points. And the SAQ section is worth 9 points. You either get it or you don't. There's no partial credit. So when we answer the question, the first tip is directly answer the question. Don't waste your time providing a lot of fluff. Keep your answer very focused on the question. When you answer the question, speak in specific terms, but don't define the terms. You can assume that the reader knows what the term means. So if you were to use the term social Darwinism, you don't need to define social Darwinism to me because I know what social Darwinism means. Keep in mind that you're writing for people with history as a background. So don't feel obligated to define the terms. Each part, so your 3 parts of an SAQ, they're really 3 different questions. They don't connect to one another. You could write this as 1 paragraph, but what we want to do is provide 3 different answers. So you always want to look at these 3 answers as individual questions. So if you get two of them right and you get one of them wrong, you'll get a 2 out of 3. It's not like if you get two right and one wrong, you get a 0 because you didn't get the whole thing right. You're getting 3 parts to the answer, 3 parts to the question. I apologize. 3 parts to the SAQ. Each part is its own thing to grade. So really, when you take the AP exam, you're not answering 3 SAQs. You're really answering 9 questions related to 3 prompts. Okay. So with each part, no more than 4 minutes, 1 to 3 sentences at the most. And we want to be efficient with this. We don't want to spend a lot of time with presenting material that doesn't matter. It's one of those things that it's sort of like in baseball or in softball. I'll use softball because I still play softball whenever this COVID-19 thing ends. If it's the 7th inning, which is the last inning, and we are losing by 1, and I come up with the bases loaded, I'm not trying to hit a grand slam. I'm trying to get 2 runs in because I only need 2 runs to win the game. I don't need 4 runs. The same thing with the SAQ. Do what you need to do to answer the question and cut out all the stuff that's irrelevant. And the other thing is, as always, remember that you're writing an argument. This is a short argument. Maybe that's what we should make it. Instead of short answer question, short argumentative question. You are going to present and support your argument. You're basically going to say, here's why I'm right. Okay. You're not repeating somebody else's right answer, even though you kind of will be. You're not repeating somebody else's right answer. You're coming up with what you think is the right answer and then rationalizing it. And with the SAQ, your rationalization needs to be short. So let's take a look at a sample. And this is going to look a lot like this is not your question for this unit, but it's going to look a lot like this. So I'm going to tell you right now, if your answers are what I give you, then I know you didn't do the assignment right. So let's say you got this, and this is a lot of what your SAQ assignment will look like. You'll get directions based on the political cartoon and your knowledge of world history. Answer each of the following parts of the question. Okay. So you go to A. How does the political cartoon demonstrate a political rationale for European imperialism between 1750 and 1900? So you're looking at that cartoon based on what you know about political rationales. Think about what you would say. And then the second, how does the political cartoon demonstrate another political rationale for European imperialism? So now I'm saying, what are 2 ways that we can look at this cartoon and see a political rationale? And then finally, how does this political cartoon demonstrate an ideological rationale for European imperialism between 1750 and 1900? So when we look at this cartoon, we're trying to come up with 2 ways we see political and 1 way we see ideological. And that's when we go into our minds, we go into our knowledge, and we remember that political deals with diplomacy, it deals with nationalism, it deals with a competition between nations. You know, the idea is that a nation has to do they have to do what's in their best interest in order to survive. And then ideological deals with social Darwinism and white man's burden, the idea of cultural superiority that Europeans and Americans felt over non-Europeans and Americans. So just for kicks, go ahead and pause the video and just think about how you would answer this question. So go ahead and pause it now. I'm going to take a sip of my tea. And let's take a look at how I answered it. So when I answered these questions, I probably took 2 minutes for each answer. Okay, now obviously I know this stuff pretty well, but the idea is that you don't see me going on for a long time. So for the first thing, the cartoon shows a political rationale. Let me start with this. This first 5, 6, that's just a writing tick for me. That's just something I do. When I write answers to history, I frame it with, I kind of rephrase the question. It helps me focus, But what I don't want you to do is say the political cartoon. You don't need to do that. You can just say the cartoon. Now, on the exam, you can just go, it shows a political rationale. That would be fine. Or the political rationale shown is. But I would like you to start off with something that kind of connects the question to the answer. And the reason why is it's just going to help you focus. It's also going to make your answer a little clearer to the reader. But we want to keep that short, 5, 6 words at the most. And then I go because. Now, that key word, because, that's what we call a transitional word. And what we're doing with that transitional word is showing the reader, here's my rationale. So I say the cartoon shows a political rationale because the division of Africa among the European powers would help solve potential disputes from becoming a widespread European war. So I'm remembering the diplomatic thing, and I probably could improve this by, talking about how Africa being divided up, as a way of solving, yeah, it would help solve, it'd help bring peace to potential conflict over Africa. So it's a way of preventing conflict. Okay. The second one, the cartoon shows another political rationale. So again, I'm connecting back to the question because there's my transitional phrase. The figure carving Africa among the Europeans is able to establish himself as a powerful figure among the European powers. He is able to serve his nation's interests through controlling the settlement of Africa. So I'm saying the guy with the knife is able to put himself in a position of advantage, and that connects back to nationalism, a political rationale. And then the third one, the cartoon shows an ideological rationale because Africa is viewed as a dehumanized object. Now I need to go into a little bit more rationale. By Europe imposing its will on Africa without African participation, the cartoon shows the European attitude of superiority that was popular in the 19th century due to social Darwinism. So if you look at those three answers, I am specific, but I'm not lengthy. And I'm not defining things. I'm presenting and justifying my argument. And that's the key difference between the kids who do well on the AP exam and the kids who struggle. The kids who do well understand they're presenting a historical argument and they're supporting their argument. The kids who struggle spend more time defining things. And that's where we want to make the transition. So I hope that helped you guys with writing the SAQ. As always, bring your questions to class and we'll be happy to address it. In the meantime, you guys have a great day. Take good care of yourselves, and I will see you next time. Bye.